Good morning, viewers. Actually, in New Zealand, it's good night.
Yeah.
Welcome to episode 10 of Six Strings and Other Stories. I've been watching the previous episodes of this with considerable interest, and very often I found that what the interviewer had to say was at least as interesting, if not more, than many of the people who were being interviewed. So I thought somebody needs to interview this chap. So I put it to him, and I've been today given the distinction and honor of interviewing Warren Mendonsa, who, for me, strikes me as a singer's guitarist, and anyone who sings will identify with that. Here's somebody who plays for the music, who plays for the song. One of the finest musicians I know. I give you Warren Mendonsa. Good morning.
Good morning, Jay. For those who don't know, Jay is a fabulous guitarist, vocalist, and an ophthalmologist, if I'm not mistaken. Coming to you all the way from London. I'm in Auckland, so literally at two opposite ends of the planet.
So, steel yourself. Let's
Okay,
start easy, and then
sure,
I'll ask you some difficult questions.
sure.
Tell me about your earliest musical experiences, your background, your journey, your childhood. When did you?
Like in Asterix, that Obelix, he fell into the cauldron as a baby. So that was me and music because I was born into a family of musicians where my dad and mom met because my mom went to my dad for guitar lessons. So I was always surrounded by it. There was no escaping it. And from my granddad's music of the 30s and 40s, to my dad with Beatles and jazz and different bits of classic rock. My mom being a country and western fan. And then, of course, my uncle and extended family members would always, show up, and there was some gyan to be gotten from them. So I think I started playing guitar at the age of 5 because I used to go to my dad's guitar, which was pretty much as tall as I was. And apparently, I would find the string which was in tune with the song. So I kind of, got a good idea of pitch apparently. So they thought it would be good to get me a little guitar. So at that time, I think when I got my guitar, my parents, rather my dad, he used to teach guitar after school in my school. So I took my little guitar and I went along for the classes. And the kids were bigger
But
than I was.
so by that time, you had a small one.
Yeah, little guitar. It was like one of these, this pretty nice sounding one as well. But the kids were bigger, so I used to sit with my little guitar trying to catch what was going on. And I kind of got along pretty well with the basic chords. And here's an interesting one. My dad, he showed me E and A minor as my first two chords. And right away, because you just have to move it right up and down. And I wanted to find something to play with those two chords. So he found a song called I Love Paris, which is, basically E and A minor. And then later on, it goes that A changes to a major. So I learned like the A major chord as well. And then right at the end, there's a D that comes along. So that was like, and I could play like the whole song. I was very, proud of myself. So that was like my first experience with the instrument.
So by that point, you knew A, D, and E. So
And
that would have opened up
and A minor
country
as well.
A minor as well. When
Yeah,
did the relative minor come into you? Because a lot of pop songs at that time was a four chord, right?
yeah.
C, A minor, F, G, or the
I
equal. When
think
do you learn?
then shortly after I got the C and G, so I had C, G, A minor. But F took me a while. And surprisingly, my mom showed me F. So you got to put your, one finger across those. It wasn't the full bar chord. It was like, this kind of an F. So once I got that, that was like a quantum leap. Oh, now I know F. I can play two notes with one finger.
And so therefore, would it be right to say that your first influence was the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do major scale, or did you start off with the blues scale?
Um, no, it was probably some diatonic thing because I had learned how to play La Bamba, and I think that movie had just come out where Lou Diamond Phillips played Richie Valens, and that that version, which was played by Los Lobos, had a great guitar solo. And it's like that major scale with all the open strings when if you learn how to play it. So I was trying to kind of fudge my way through that. And so once I learned La Bamba, then I think I learned Black Knight. by Deep Purple, and something along those lines, some very basic riffs. But the thing is, I didn't really take it too seriously. I was more interested in playing bass because my dad had this gorgeous Fender jazz bass. And given the choice between acoustic guitar and Fender jazz bass plugged into this big Fender Bassman amp, of course you want to play the electric instrument. And then my dad kept discouraging me, saying, "No, I'm just stick with the guitar. You'll be better off playing guitar in the long run."
May I deviate for a second on
Yeah,
that? You started playing bass guitar, and I know that on the album you recently did, you played the bass
yeah.
yourself. And playing bass and rhythm are sort of very similar in terms of a mental outlook. Playing lead is something completely different. Would you say that your bass playing encouraged your own rhythm guitar playing?
Yeah, I guess so. I didn't really have any ambitions to really be a lead guitarist as such. I mean, I used to sing when I was a kid, so my whole objective of playing guitar was to accompany myself. And then my parents would enter me into these local church talent competitions. So I think there was only one time I won first prize. It was when I was 3 years old. I sang "Do a Deer." I remember getting an ice cream after that. So I was like, oh, this is a profitable enterprise. It pays off.
It was the do re mi fa sol la ti do
Yeah,
scale that's
pretty
off.
much. Yeah. I didn't really get
Yes.
into the blues till I got out of school. You know,
Uh-huh.
that was like much later. And I started listening to Cream. I think that was my conduit into the blues. And of course, I mean, I was a big Beatles fan from the age of 8 till 13. I didn't listen to anything else. Like the kids in my school were listening to Guns N' Roses and Metallica, and they were like, "What are you listening to this Beatles stuff?" I said, "Man, I don't really like anything else apart from this." So, I mean, there's plenty of blues in the Beatles stuff as well. So, I guess subconsciously that was filtering through as well.
So I was going to ask you if the instrument started as a backing instrument for you, and it did. But have you stopped singing? Do you still sing?
No, my voice cracked, I think, when I was around 13, and after that, I didn't have the courage to get back into it.
Have you ever considered it now?
Well, I sing songs to my daughter sometimes, so there's that.
So there'll be a children's album coming out shortly.
No, no, no.
So yes, you've answered that. I was going to ask you, did you start off with the Beatles and Elvis Presley and then move on to the progressive rock groups? That's exactly what you did. So what about your first electric guitar? I take it your first one was an acoustic guitar, as you
Yep.
said just now.
Okay, so that's an interesting story as well because I was like determined to get some kind of distortion happening on the instrument because that's like the sound I was hearing, as I was growing up. Even with the Beatles stuff and all, you can hear like the thing on Abbey Road, what's her song? "I Want You, She's So Heavy." That sustain and everything that you don't get that from an acoustic guitar. So my first experiments were with this Walkman that had a mic in it, and if you press it into record, you could monitor the mic of that on headphones. So I would plug in headphones and put that mic right against the guitar, and like play into it, and I could hear this distortion in the headphones. But there was no way to convey it. Like I couldn't make other people hear it. It was just because obviously if you put it through a speaker, it's going to feedback like crazy. So the next step, I think I took part in some quiz competition in school, and I got like some, little bit of money. So I went to that Hariba Vishwanath store down the road, which is an Indian classical instrument store. But they had this 100 rupee pickup with, I remember it had orange colored pole pieces. I don't know what the deal was, but
That fit in
it's,
the sound,
sorry?
fit in the sound hole?
Yeah, I had to kind of like stick it with some duct tape and some glue and something like that, but I managed to get it in place. And I was moving it around. I remember like, oh, it sounds different here, and different positions and stuff like that. And my granddad had this Videocon 2-in-1 that he wasn't using. So at that time, I kind of gotten pretty adept with a soldering iron as well. So I kind of did like this jugaad thing where I disconnected the head on one of the decks and plugged the pickup. It's just like be following basic signal flow. Okay, that goes into that and stuff, but it would distort again. So I would kind of get a little bit of overdrive from this Videocon 2-in-1, and that became my rig. And then I remember a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, who later on became a bandmate. He borrowed the guitar, and he was coming down his steps with the guitar, and he slipped and he fell, and the part of the guitar got smashed. So that became my excuse to my parents. Now, see, he broke my guitar. Now he don't knew what. So they've finally bought me this guitar called the Hofner Galaxy. At the time, I had no idea what this guitar was. I only knew it was made in Germany, which was supposedly better than made in Calcutta. So Hofner better than Hobner. 3,000 rupees. It had three humbuckers, and like every humbucker had a volume control as well as an on-off switch. And then there was one other switch for rhythm and solo. It just made it softer for rhythm and louder, that sort of thing. And I had no idea what that guitar was all about. And I mean, for me, it wasn't doing the job because the moment you put some distortion on it, it became microphonic, right? So you could hear your voice through the speaker. So that wasn't really my favorite, electric guitar ever. But it got the job done for those, early years. And then I think a couple of years later, for my 19th birthday, I got a Fender Mexican Strat with a Floyd Rose, one humbucker, two single coils, one volume, one tone. And that got me through like...
Was that the Richie Sambora model?
No, it was kind of like it, but a slightly lower, because it was the Sambora I remember was around 35,000 rupees, and this one was around 20,000. It was affordable, but not like cheap. It was like a fair bit of money still. The American ones at that time were like 40 and 50,000 and further up the chain, which in retrospect seems very cheap. But at that time, it was like, oh, don't even think about that. Don't look at that part of the shop.
So did you get an amplifier to go with that instantly, or
I was kind of lucky in that department because two amplifiers came my way. One was my uncle who lived upstairs, rather my granddad's brother. He built an electric guitar in the 50s, I think. Wound his own pickups and everything. Very enterprising guy. And he got the guy who made like local hi-fi audio systems. He got him to make an amp, which now I know was a copy of a Vox AC10 because it had the same tube component and everything. But that thing was able to distort, like if you turned it up, you got this really amazing power tube distortion, which is like something that most guitar players crave.
And this was a non-master volume amp?
Yeah, it had three of those screw-on jacks. So I took those screw-on jacks and I put one like normal, phono socket, and I jumpered all three. So I got like three gain knobs, one after the other. And like it would get pretty, gainy for a thing like which was built in the 50s, of whenever it was 50s, 60s, something like that. And I also got my dad's Bassman, which he used to play through. So this was like a 135 watt master volume Bassman, which just did not distort. That was like the whole selling point of that amp. This amp doesn't distort.
Need 4x10 Bassman?
No. It was a head and a 2x12 cabinet. Okay. It was silver face, I think. Yeah.
Silver. I know the one.
It would be 70s, late 70s. It just didn't distort. So then I had the wise idea, that small amp, it distorts, but it's damn soft, because once I remember at some party I was playing through that amp and a clarinet player was louder. I was like, okay, we cannot have this ever happen again.
That might make you a lot of money now, right? Everybody wants saturation at low volumes.
Exactly. Well, those days there was none of that, right? It just had to be louder than everything else. So I came up with the idea of plugging that small amp into the big one, which I have no idea how that worked. It worked. I mean, you got like a good distorted sound, but it wasn't safe for that small amp in the long run. So at some gig, it blew. That was the end of that. I wish I still had it. It was a very cool sound.
Have you ever thought of making one? You're handy with a soldering iron.
Oh, well, I'll probably just better off buying a Vox AC10 if one pops up. You never know.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what about pedals?
I didn't have any pedals. I think after that amp blew, then I was on the lookout for something that distorted. And by that time, I made a few friends, and one of them, I think, was selling a old Boss HM2 heavy metal. And he had a DS1, which I actually wanted the DS1 because it sounded a little bit sweeter. But he said, no, I'm not selling that. That one I'm keeping. You can buy this HM2. So I kind of got it sounding pretty decent. I said, okay, I'll take it. Now those the HM2s have become very collectible. So you could, I should have probably kept mine. But, that became like my main distortion unit. My dad had an old Boss GE6 graphic EQ. So those two pedals, I kind of mounted them on one piece of plywood. That was my pedal board. There was no reverb, delay, and everything because we used to practice like in this kind of places which had lots of natural reverb. So you didn't really, need that.
And have you seen people with pedal boards, or was it your independent idea? Let me mount them on a piece of plywood.
I just was fed up of plugging them in. I had never seen a pedal board. But at that time, everyone was playing Zoom processors. That was the rage. Zoom and Digitech. If you had money, you could buy the Digitech. Otherwise, the Zoom was the cheaper one.
Not even at that time. And were you in a band by this point?
Yeah, I'd gotten together with some friends of mine. So I had a friend called Johan. From the day I was born, I knew him because our dads knew each other from way back when. So the dads, I think, were the ones who kind of said, okay, if one plays bass, the other should play guitar because both of them were bassists. Both the dads were bassists. And they could never be in the same band together, as you know.
Yeah.
So they said, okay, one should play guitar, one should play bass. So I think Johan, my friend, he used to play guitar first and I used to play bass. And then at one point we, ended up swapping over. So Johan, me, and Johan's neighbors were Rajiv and Bobby. We got together and, played a few covers and stuff like that. But we didn't really do a gig till another friend of my dad's moved back into town, close just down the road. And his son, Sid, was someone I'd known since I was a kid. But, we hadn't really become friends or anything because he used to live in like different cities and stuff like that. So now that he was finally back in town, and he came over and he was like, oh, you listen to Iron Maiden and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, yeah. So we kind of got together and started jamming. But Sid was like more metal oriented and we were like, no, we can't do any of that stuff. Right now what we're working on is some Beatles and Eagles and, that kind of stuff. So he also was drafted and came with his bright green guitar and everything. And then that evolved eventually into a band called Vicious Circle, which was a strictly classic rock covers band. We did one gig and then Johan left to go study in the States and that was the end of that band. And so then Sid had the idea, hey, remember Johan's neighbors? We should get them. And then that evolved into like my first proper band, which was called Zero.
Was that an instrumental band?
No. That was very much like straight up rock, maybe a little bit of alternative. And we would cover like Pearl Jam and Lynyrd Skynyrd, all different kinds of stuff. But it was like the whole idea was just to have fun, There was nothing like serious about, we got to like, whenever we practiced, our whole practice would just turn into like laughing and, that kind of thing. We kind of eventually started sounding pretty decent, but the whole idea was never like, we would see these other bands like take their music very seriously and, practice a lot and stuff like that. And we were like, I don't think we're ever going to get to that point. So you might as well have fun. And then we had this, bright idea that, look, if we start playing our own songs, no one's going to really know when we make mistakes. Like if you cover Deep Purple or something, everyone knows those songs. So like if you make a mistake, it's, you're wide open. But if you're doing your own songs, there's a little bit of a, or did they mean to do that? And at that time, Sid and I had started writing. And the whole focus of our writing was to kind of come up with memorable parts or choruses or hooks so we ourselves could remember. There was no like iPhone, you could take it out and make a voice memo. That wasn't happening. You could kind of record it on a cassette and, but, just making an intelligible recording was a bit of a challenge. So the whole focus was like, okay, the choruses at least have to be like pretty catchy so we can remember them. And as a result of that, I guess the songs were able to, being original compositions, were able to communicate to an audience at the time who could, they come back to the next gig singing along with the songs,
And did you mix these up with cover versions, or did you do
Yeah,
exclusively your own?
over time the covers started getting weaned out. I remember the first time we actually played IIT Mood Indigo seriously. We had gotten it to a point where there were no covers in that set. Otherwise, like some of the other bands, it was still rely on the covers and then slip in. There were a few bands that would play their own songs, like Pentagram and Indiscreet and bands like that. But on the whole, I would say it was pretty much still a cover dominated scene at that time. The whole idea was like you played exact versions of the recorded music, and the that would kind of almost guarantee you a good audience response, where that was just not something we could do. So the whole idea was then let's do our own songs the best we can.
But as you said, you had to sing along choruses,
Most of them.
which is what launched the whole maintained the whole career of bands like Bon Jovi, for example,
Yeah,
even.
pretty much. I mean,
And
the
for how
Beatles
long?
had sing along choruses.
Yes, yes. For how long did that last?
That, I think our first gig was 1998, and the last gig I played with them was 2004. And they
So,
continued for another 4 years after that.
so by this point, were you musically literate, or were you? Did you learn music as a child to read and write? Or
Well, my dad told me, like, okay, these are the notes of the major scale. Now you take 1, 3, 5, and you have your, one major and so on and so forth. So I kind of knew the basic groundwork. And then I was like, okay, what's this seventh and major seventh? And he's like, okay, you just go past that eight and you start adding the other notes and the how do you build chords and stuff like that. And he said, well, if you learn your scales everywhere across the neck, you'll kind of be able to know where the notes of the chords are as well, as a result of that. So I kind of did a little bit of that kind of groundwork, but I never really, which I kind of regret, I never really sat and did like alternate picking, d d d d d that kind of stuff. Any exercise that was not musical wasn't for me. If the exercise was musical and it sounded good as a piece of music, I would practice it. But if it sounded atonal, like playing, chromatics and stuff like that, I didn't have anything to do with that. I was more
and
interested in chord progressions actually, which I still am. That's like the thing that drives me the most.
in terms of reading music off a stave notation, is that something you learned?
Never, because I mean, I used to go and learn piano upstairs with another aunt of my dad's, and she would make me read from a piece of paper, and I kind of got the basic gist of that every good boy does fine and that kind of stuff. But I was struggling with being able to read and even play very basic whole note melodies. I used to struggle with that. So I would memorize everything and I would pretend to read and play. And then one day the page turned over and then she saw that I was playing something totally different and then she got angry. And I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. So I begged my dad, okay, I can't do this. He said, okay, there's another teacher who will teach you classical guitar. So that guy came and again he insisted I read. I think these guys should have just figured out like this kid is a dumbass at reading. Just show him the stuff and let him learn it by ear, which is still what I rely on the most. Even like at this point in as a musician, I rely on the ear the most. Anyway, so I never really got you, but I can sight read like a chord chart, for example. Like you give me a chord chart, I can play my way through that. That's fine. But if you make
And
me
is
read
that,
single notes, I can't do that.
and is that how you worked your to deviate a little bit? I know that you played in the Bombay music in the movie industry quite a lot. Is that what you relied upon to
Yeah,
navigate through your sessions?
they would say come in, have a listen to the song, and I would have a listen. And I mean, to be completely honest, there wasn't that much happening harmonically. Once in a while, there was something where I would have to ask, like, what is that chord, or what's happening here, and that would be explained to me because I was always like communicating with other musicians. For example, like usually the keyboard player used to help me, or whoever was programming or arranging. I would just go and sit next to them and just watch them. And I could kind of tell like where their hands were, if they would play that, and I could kind of know what the notes are. But what they would eventually realize is that I was good at coming up with hooks. And that's kind of what drove most of it, and also good at playing rhythm. I'd say a good 80% of my career as a professional musician I spent playing rhythm guitar rather than, you know, diddly. That happens once in a while, and that's like the icing on the cake. But to bake the cake, all the rhythm layers and these little, kind of textures and stuff that I put in that has nothing to do with soloing.
It's interesting that you should say that, which leads me to my next question. We have this nebulous expression, tone. This guitarist has good tone, that guitarist doesn't, and it's so subjective. But as a musician playing in, if I use the word Bollywood, not in a derogatory manner, it's a large industry there. When you have to play a different song each time in a different tone, what would you say is your own voice?
I've realized over the years that I've played a lot of different guitars and a lot of different amps, but there's some kind of a sensibility in my head that I kind of tweak it towards, from the way I attack it, where I pick on the length of the string, to how I set my amp, and the my use of reverb and delay and stuff like that. It's kind of like I hear a sound in my head and move towards that. It's almost like you have to visualize it first and then get there. So it's like different guitars have different kind of textures and stuff like that, but I can kind of get it, any guitar sounding like what I want it to sound like in my head, that sort of thing. So I don't know, it's just like by default it just comes out.
Yes. And it's interesting that you say most of your work was rhythm guitar playing. Would you consider yourself primarily in your own mind rhythm guitarist? Because you've made this beautiful album lately on which you played practically everything. And hooks, I would agree. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I can't get it out of my head. And I told you that's my favorite line, and you said that's what my daughter's singing.
Yeah.
What did you enjoy doing the most in the album that you made?
I kind of enjoyed getting back to playing bass, to be honest, because like that's a big thing for me. Because even on the previous albums, I would give Adi, who played bass with Black Flag Blues, I would give him suggestions, things that he could use, or if there was like a particular bass line that I based the whole section on, for example, then he would replicate that, for example. So I kind of really enjoyed coming back to playing bass, and it's kind of like a throwback to my very first album, because that was recorded when I just moved to New Zealand, and my brother did all the drum programming, which I couldn't do at the time, and I did everything else from bass to acoustic guitar, electric guitar, and then some strings. I still score strings like with a mouse, on the piano roll, that sort of thing. And, just exploring different textures, because the previous three albums, for example, were all written in such a way that we could pull off that material live. And with this album, I was like, there's no such constraint. I don't know when the next time I'm going to gig is, given, the whole situation. So it was, let me just, explore different sounds, explore different textures. Don't worry about if it's, 3 tracks or 24 tracks or whatever. Just do whatever feels
This was
good.
your, this was your Sergeant Pepper's.
I don't know. I guess so. Who knows?
Unconstrained by the need to.
Yeah.
Tell me something. Do you think you sound very similar and play similar at widely disparate instruments and amps? If I gave you my guitar and my amp, I imagine you'd sound just like yourself.
Yeah, or close to it. I mean, there is a certain thing that different instruments make you kind of play a little bit differently. But
Hmm.
like I say, if I was struggling with the action, I wouldn't really try to play anything too fast.
Yeah.
I would concentrate on more like, slower phrases and stuff like that. If a guitar was a little bit screechy, then I wouldn't really dig in too hard. I'd try and kind of play a little bit more lighter, just like, to make the thing sound a little bit more palatable. And whereas if it was too warm, then I may kind of just dig in and try to get a little bit more harmonic content out of it, or whatever. So these kind of things happen very subconsciously. You don't really, think about them.
And when you've been in a bunch of bands playing live on many occasions, do you play? I mean, do you play for the other members in the band? Do you play for the audience? Do you play for yourself? What do you feel makes a band come together and sound like a tight, well knit unit?
I try to establish a relationship with the drummer and bassist. First the drummer, then the bassist. If I can rely on the bassist to do his job and know his notes, that's the thing. If the bass player knows harmony, I'm set. You know. Whereas like if he doesn't, then I may struggle a little bit in that sense. Because sometimes I would kind of rely on the bass player to kind of lead into a next chord, for example. That sort of thing. Otherwise, then I find I have to kind of compensate and do that. But if I have a good relationship with the drummer and I'm comfortable, then, that's great. If I can't get that lock with the drummer, then I'm kind of fighting the whole gig.
And what's the feedback you get from the singers that you've worked with?
Um,
Because
if
guitarists
if
usually
my
try
if my
to.
amps are pointing at them, sometimes I get these weird looks. So I kind of started like pointing him the other direction.
Because then the singer can't hear himself.
No, the thing is, they always have their mics really loud in the in-ears these days. So, like, if the mic is pointing at your amp and it's picking up all that, then the monitor engineer can't really reduce you any further. You're already picking up on the vocal mic. So I'm a little mindful of that. But I did come across this thing like where, like, if I was playing rhythm distortion, I would sculpt that sound so it wouldn't get in the way of the vocals. I would make that peak at a slightly different frequency at where the singer was. So like you can still have some presence in the mix. Otherwise, the first thing the sound engineer on front of house will do will pull our faders down if you're
Yeah,
fighting the vocals. Because especially in India, you have to hear the vocal. Otherwise,
yeah.
the audience people get like restless and stuff. They come and start shouting at the sound. They turn the vocal up and all. So you have to make sure that you don't fight in that. And when they are not singing and there's like a solo section, my solo sound is like, it lifts up like, and it fills up a lot more room. And the front of house guy doesn't have to do anything. He just keeps the fader where it, and it suddenly like it becomes like this. But when the person is singing, when there's a vocal part, like I make sure I usually stay out of the way.
Which is why you're so obviously a singer's guitarist. That's
I
the
mean,
real.
I want to hear the vocal as well. I mean, my enjoyment from the song is especially if it's a vocal driven song. I want to hear the vocal. Otherwise, I mean, I might as well just be, you know, playing some DDDD at the back.
And do you pay attention to the lyrics in music? Because your newest album is an instrumental album. When you wrote songs, were you very lyric focused or melody focused, or both?
Over time, I've come to appreciate like the role of a good lyric, in music. Otherwise, like to me, the stuff that would grab me lyrically was like, John Lennon, Steely Dan, where like the words have a certain musical value as well. Like just the tonality of each syllable, for example. It wasn't just like reading off a piece of paper. The words were written in a certain way to sound good with that music, and it sticks in your head like that bit, bad sneakers and a pina colada, my friend, in that Steely Dan song. Just the way that phrase is, and there's like the emphasis on certain rhythm with the words, and I love all that kind of stuff, and I like a good rhyme, which doesn't sound like a nursery rhyme. Which is why I love like hip hop vocalists as well, because like the sense of rhythm they have, and especially the guys who freestyle, it's almost like a jazz horn play or something like that. Just the way they use words and rhythm. So that's taken me a little bit of like when I was a kid, I wouldn't really. If it grabbed me, it grabbed me, and if it didn't, I wouldn't really spend too much time doing that. But with regards to like playing in recordings, I've had people like translate lyrics because my command of the Hindi language is not the best. It's it's decent, but there are certain words like, and sometimes they borrow a lot of Urdu words, which I have no idea what this means. So I have to ask them, what does this mean? So then I kind of know what the basic lyrical context of the song is. So then whatever I'm doing supports that lyrical idea as well.
That's really lovely. So when you one thing I've noticed about your own solos is it's never a flurry of notes. And yet once in a while you come up with a flurry of notes and I'm thinking, what was that again? Unlike, to quote the most obvious one, Malmsteen, who plays 100 miles an hour, you don't do that. Your playing is Your phrasing is very nice. Do you consciously work on that? Or is that something that you've developed over the years that emerges naturally when you play now?
No,
Or do you still find yourself working
I
on that?
I can't maintain speed past a certain point. I can do it like you said in short flurries. Be it. I used to like actually when I played in zero. I used to have very light gauge strings. I used to have eights, and my action was really low. And I used to play with a very light touch. And then I got my first Marshall, which needed you to dig in, if you wanted to get that thing to crunch up. So then I started getting heavier gauge strings. I worked my way up to 11s, and then the action went up a little bit. And then
And
finally, sorry?
still your HSS strat? This was still your HSS strat at this
Yeah,
point?
yeah, yeah, yeah. That I had that HSS Strat as my main guitar all the way till 2002 or three when I got my first American Strat. So, point being, like I had to like kind of dig in a little bit, and then obviously those legato lines which I could play on eights, I couldn't do that, you know, on this. So then that became more like the right hand became more percussive and that kind of thing happening. Uh, this at this point, because I've actually been spending time like alternate picking, then maybe the chops have gone up a little bit. It's kind of like long overdue, but I figured like better late than never. So now I can kind of maintain a little bit of speed because of the ability to alternate pick, which I did not have before.
When you went up successive gauges of strings, was your guitar set up to take those strings, or did you just put them on and just cope with it?
No, I had to tighten the truss rod because the,
You
the the
did that
neck
at
would
that
keep
point.
pulling up. But at one point, I remember on that poor my first guitar, I tightened it too much and I broke the truss rod. So then it needed surgery. This guy had to like cut a little bit of the wood, pull out the truss rod, put in a new one, and kind of glue that piece of wood back.
And this is the Fender.
Yeah, it's a Mexican pen. I just saw one on this auction site starting at around 600 New Zealand dollars. So
Okay.
I was kind of tempted, but then I was like, every single guitar I've got here has a better guitar than that. So I used to hate that Floyd Rose because the curvature would never match the curvature of the neck,
Yes.
So like the outer strings would have a slightly higher action and you couldn't get them down. So you kind of had to live with that. So yeah,
It was
no,
bad.
I won't get it.
Was your Mexican Fender a 7.25 or 9.5?
I think it was 7 and a quarter because it was pretty curved, and the Floyd, as you know, is much flatter. So in retrospect, that was a badly matched bridge to the neck.
Which brings me to your current guitars. Why the Strat? Is that because that's the first major guitar you had and your playing has been built around that, or have you consciously selected the Strat as your primary instrument?
My theory is that like the first electric instrument I fell in love with was my dad's jazz bass. So now from the Fender lineup, see which guitar looks most like the jazz bass. It's the Strat, right?
That would be the Jaguar, actually, but carry on.
I mean, it's still got the up horn and the down horn. I mean, body shape, more than anything. So and plus, like on these guitar magazines, I would see like Clapton and Hendrix, and they just look so cool. Whereas the Les Paul, whenever I got my hands on it, it would seem like a slightly, because of the scale length, a slightly more compact instrument, and I would have trouble like getting up there. So I I gravitated to the feel of a Strat like the first time I held it. It's like, okay, this feels a bit more like home. And then once I got into like how the pickups, different pickups work, and once you figure out you can assign the tone knob to the bridge and roll off some tone and that kind of thing. I think I was doing that for my first gig because I didn't really have that many pedals. I didn't have one pedal for this. I had that HM2 that was on, and then I started dropping my volume to kind of get like an in-between distortion, and then roll off my tone to get that Clapton kind of, that Sunshine of Your Love kind of a warm tone and everything like that. So once I got a hang of that, I was really, chuffed. And then I think initially I used to use the whammy bar, but I couldn't get it to stay in tune. So
Ah,
for years, I locked the whole thing. I put 5 springs, and the bridge was flush with the body. And then I think in my early 20s, I started getting into Jeff Beck. And then now once you listen to Jeff Beck, you're like, oh, I need to do some of that. So then the bridge started floating, and I still had a 2 point bridge at that time. It wasn't the vintage bridge. So it's a little bit easier to manage in that sense, So and then I think I got into locking tuners. But I think once I got the Eric Johnson strats, I kind of figured as long as the nut is lubricated and you have enough of wraps, around the tuning posts, it stays in tune. I kind of came across like these suggestions that Scott Henderson had popped on his forum. So like the 6 screw bridge, apparently the holes of the bridge are a little bit too small for the screws. So you just drill them out a little bit wider, and the inner 4 screws are slightly higher. So it's kind of using just the outer 2 to pivot and the middle 4 for support. And once you have it floating at the requisite angle where you can pull up as well, I find it actually stays in tune better. Like if it was flush and you were making it do that, then coming back to tuning becomes an issue. But if it's already floating and you're just doing that, it kind of comes back to that position a little bit better. So somehow it works.
I read that too, and it struck me you could just use slightly narrower screws instead of drilling out the treble.
Yeah, but finding those screws again becomes a problem. And I had a drill bit and I didn't have screws.
So coming back to the Strat, you finally wound up with a flatter radius. It's a 12-inch radius that you prefer, isn't it?
Yeah.
With a 42 millimeter nut. Would that be right? 1.65?
I don't know what the nut is, to be honest. I don't really pay that much attention. The radius is the thing I care about the most.
12-inch. And tell me about the practicalities, because most Strat players play a 9.5 and you play a 12. Tell us about that, please, because that's a little unusual for a Strat player, and you are quintessentially a Stratocaster player, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, the 9.5 is fine as well. I mean, I've also played like 7.25 guitars. Like my Tele 7.25, and it plays fine. So I find it depends from instrument to instrument. But generally, the flatter it is, the lower you can have your higher strings and bend them without them choking out. Otherwise, like say on a smaller radius, like a 7.25, you need to have those strings set a little bit higher than you would like, just so when you bend, they don't choke out.
Yeah. And your fret size?
I've always liked jumbos, because I used to love Stevie Ray Vaughan and Gary Moorestones, and both those guys were like jumbo fret aficionados. So I was like, okay, I'll try that. And the first time I had a guitar fretted with that, I was like, oh, where have you been all my life? That sort of thing. I do have one of the Strats which still has the medium frets, which is nice because I guess the intonation is a little better with smaller frets. Otherwise, the higher the fret is, the more you kind of press it and may drive it out of tune. So for like rhythm and chordy stuff, I kind of like that one. But if I'm playing like solo stuff, I kind of really like the jumbo frets.
And we're talking 6100s.
Yeah.
Nickel silver or stainless steel?
I'm guessing nickel. I haven't got a guitar with stainless steel, so yeah, they would be nickel silver.
And have you worn frets out before?
Yeah. I mean, this guitar is on its secondary fret, the main one. And the original black Strat of mine, which was lost by Air Canada, that I think had 3 refrets, if I'm not mistaken.
So these are seriously played instruments, not like us amateurs getting stainless steel frets when even ordinary guitars don't wear out.
Yeah. I mean, I guess at some point I will try it, but till now that day has not come.
Any other custom mods, Warren, on your Strats? You mentioned wiring the bridge to the second tone control.
Yeah. So that last, I'll show it you actually once. Oh, where is it? Yeah. So this last position, when it's all the way down, is only the bridge pickup. And that for me is only on this last tone knob. So from the next one all the way down to the neck, it's on this tone knob. And on this particular guitar for this this guy, there's no tone knob when it's on the neck in the middle. So you get the brightest, chimiest sound with that. and everyone else it's on that. So I use this 4-pole 5-way switch called a super switch, which lets you kind of do anything in that regard. And another thing for the humbucker and single coils, the humbucker is seeing a 500K and the single coils are seeing 250K. I made a video called HSS Strat, so I explained the whole thing down to the
Is the
wiring
Strat
schematic and everything.
the Strat you put together take the place of that old black
Yeah,
Strat
it's
that
a way better instrument. So I'm kind of in a way happy that that happened. Otherwise, I never would have changed it. I was just so familiar with that instrument, and then it kind of got lost at the same time as my daughter was born. So it's kind of one goes, one comes, that sort of thing. And I finally got them to pay out for losing my guitar. And then I had gone to Singapore where I found this second-hand Eric Johnson Strat. I think someone had tried to make it a David Gilmour Strat because they had added that toggle switch to combine the neck and the bridge. Yeah.
you
So
like that.
I've never used that sound, to be honest. I may have very early in the 0 days tried it and may have used it like in lieu of a Telecaster, but then if you want that sound, then just use a Tele. So I have no need of it.
So may I deviate a little bit?
Yeah.
Various humbuckers with coil splitting and various single coil simulations. Do you find yourselves interested by those sounds? Do you use them, or do you just pick up
Nah,
a Fender instead?
that's something I'd explored in the very early days of getting my guitar. I kind of looked at all different kinds of wiring possibilities. One thing that's interesting is putting the coils of a humbucker in parallel. That's quite cool, but I haven't got that on a guitar at this point. Also, like changing the phasing of the coils, like how Brian May does, putting the coils in series and then flipping the phase on one. I really think at one point I should get a Brian May guitar, just because I love his sounds, and that's like really interesting, like the way he, combines different pickups and to get different sounds. So yeah,
The red spec.
yeah,
The red spec.
but I'll see if I can get it in black.
And when you have a HSS, do you have a more powerful humbucker which gives you a volume boost and a good position 2 sound, or do you go with a weak humbucker so that the humbucker isn't much louder, sacrificing position 2 with
Yeah,
when it's
the weaker one. So what I've got is Sir Thornbuckle, which is I guess in the 8ish, like lower kind of thing. I used to in an earlier guitar have, I think it wasn't a JB, what was it? Oh, it was a Seymour Duncan Allen Holdsworth, which was a darker sounding thing. And then I realized I could just have a bright humbucker and roll off the tone. It doesn't have to be that dark. But even at that time, I would kind of keep the humbucker slightly low and have because you can just adjust the height, right? If you want it louder, you can just bring it up. So I adjust the height so maybe the humbucker has a little bit of a lift, You don't want it like a single coil, otherwise you may as well have a single coil there.
yeah, yeah.
So you get a little bit of that mid-range push as well from the humbucker. But again, I kind of have always liked lower output pickups.
So how do you set your amp, Warren? Do you set it up clean and then boost it with a pedal? Do you set it up on the edge of distortion? How do you set your amp?
Depends upon the amp, because most of these guys are single channel amps, and I'd set it to that point where if I hit hard, it'll just about break up. And then I put the pedals on. So I've normally always kind of gone with this, at least for years and years, gone with this 3-pedal kind of thing. So one pedal is like almost like a clean boost, which may brighten things up a little bit. So either an RC booster or a Vemiram Jan Ray, or like, what does this have? Like that Greer Lightspeed. They're just brightening up the top end a little bit and giving maybe a little bit of a mid-range push. So then when you roll your volume down, that's the trick. So when you have that pedal on, you roll your volume down, it doesn't get dark. Otherwise, most guitars, you turn that volume down, it just goes like that,
Which is why you can afford not to have a treble bleed on your guitar.
Yeah, pretty much. So I always have like one of those pedals on. So it's the cleaner one which brightens things up. Then I have a Tube Screamer style thing, which is bass cut and high mid up, and then the Maxon SD9, which is kind of like a flatter, more gain, but that's like my main lead sound. So like the cleaner stuff I'll use, like the live board, because I'm using a single channel amp that's a Marshall. And if you want to make a Marshall sound like a clean Fender, put on a fuzz face and drop your guitar volume. Just see it, because it adds that mid scoop, It starts sounding like almost like a Fender blackface kind of a thing.
What I've done is put a GE7 in the effects loop and scoop it.
Yeah, but generally I find pedals in the effects loop are not really my thing because of the levels. The effects loops are generally higher levels, and the pedals tend to start sounding a bit crappy.
That's a bit, yes. And you mentioned your pedals, you mentioned your amp setup on the edge of distortion. What about your guitar? Where do you set your guitar?
The volume will be around 7. The bridge tone, I kind of do that thing where I turn it all the way off and then I open up till it goes "Wah," and just as that formant opens up, I leave it there. So usually on most of my guitars between 3 to 5, between 3, 4, 5 around there. The neck and all will be around like 8, 7 or 8, depending upon how bright the amp is. Usually if it has a bright switch, I use the bright switch. But say like on a twin reverb, on a gig, maybe you don't want the bright switch on there. Because one hack I used to use, over time I still carry my own amp heads and use the rental speaker cabinet. But then the airline we used to fly on, Jet Airways, that went away, and then we were on these budget airlines where the baggage allowance was like, you blink and you're overweight. So I started carrying like a small pedal board and 2 speaker cables, heavy duty speaker cable. So I'd ask for 2 twin reverbs and 2 Marshall 4x12s. So I would disconnect the twin reverb speakers and plug the twin reverb amp parts into the Marshall cabs.
Okay. Celestians.
Yeah. Because the thing is, like on a stage, especially with singers, those twin reverbs are open backs and they tend to spread the sound a bit more, whereas those Marshalls would just kind of have this very narrow focus, and it was loud only in that part. But once you went away from that, it wasn't, leaking into other. But if the audience was standing right in front, they would have, gotten their heads taken off. But luckily the stages were always like higher, so they were firing over the audience's heads most of the time.
And by this time, we are talking fairly high-profile gigs with big singers from Bollywood.
Big,
you can't
big
afford
stages.
to turn your speaker towards them.
No.
If you want to keep your job.
No. I mean, sometimes they would come and say, like, if they were enjoying it and all, they would, like, pull out their earplug, turn it up and everything. But sometimes I would get these looks like, asshole, turn it down.
That's lovely. You mentioned the Henderson mods on your guitar and the Henderson wiring and positions 2 and 4, where you don't have a tone control at all. That's really fascinating. Do you find that useful while recording, or is it primarily whilst gigging?
Usually gigging, because you don't really have time to, once you move that selector switch, you don't have time to readjust the tone. So it's kind of presetting things at, different levels of brightness. And I find it more useful when you're kind of using like a slightly driven Marshall as your bass sound. Whereas like on a Fender kind of thing, you already have a little bit more of that sparkle, So we're trying to get that out of the Marshall, then having the tone not in those 2 and 4 positions. It opens it up, so you get that nice kind of chimey, clean kind of thing if you roll your volume down.
And I imagine that the album that you recorded recently, you used your amplifiers, mic'd them up with the...
I didn't mic them. I've used these Sir reactive loads for the longest time. I think 3 or 4 years now. So there are 2 loads, so I can actually record more than one amp. So you can turn your amp up to concert level, plug it into this, which is a total silent thing, and then it goes straight into the interface.
And you use the modeling in your recording software?
I use some basic speaker simulation from these Universal Audio amp sims. You can defeat the amp part and just use the speaker simulation.
So obviously you rate the speaker simulation. You think it's good enough to go on on your record. So do you believe that speaker simulation is streets ahead of amplifier simulation at the moment?
Yeah, because at least if you're using real tubes for the the bulk of the tone, that's where it comes from the amp usually for me. Uh, when people say what does a pedal sound like, I was like, what amp are you going to plug it into? Because the amp will define what the pedal sounds like usually. There are certain pedals that kind of have like very unique tones, and they kind of tend to override the amp part of it. But for most of it, once the amp is doing its job, and then everything, like my simple Boss SD1 pedal sounds great into channel 2 of this. Once that amp is cooking, just everything it's supposed to. So I'd rather keep that bit analog. And to be honest, if I was able to kind of soundproof, some part of my house and put a speaker cabinet and have it mic'd up, I would love to do that. But at this point, I have to be a little pragmatic, and I have neighbors, I have a family, so I can't really turn this up. I have been actually able to record what do you call it, the speaker cabs at very soft volumes. There's a way of doing it, but you have to really move the mic and kind of get it at one particular place. So that sometimes takes a little bit of work. But
And how would you monitor that? With headphones, keeping
with
moving it until you
with
feel it looks right?
headphones, yeah, pretty much. And ideally close back headphones, because these are open back, so the amp leaks, and
Yeah.
so you don't want that to get in the way. And I found another cool thing, like if you run the amp through the reactive load, okay, and load it down, you can take the line out of the load and run it into a small solid state amplifier like I use at Boss Katana Mini, and that drives the cab. So it's kind of like reamping it, and that's something I think was done from like Eddie Van Halen used to do that in the 80s. He used to load the cranked Marshall down and then slave it back up to solid state power amps into a cab.
Isn't there an old story that he bought a Marshall and it sounded lovely, but it was very, very soft? And he didn't realize it, but it was a 240-volt UK Marshall, which he was running at 110
Yeah.
volts.
Th-
Tell us
There's
about this.
there's many different stories. Generally, with anything Eddie Van Halen related, you kind of have to take things he said also with a pinch of salt. But there's this really cool book I was reading that this guy called Brad Tolinsky, who used to write for Guitar World. He's just come out. It's called Eruption. So I was just getting back into, Actually, Eddie was a pretty big influence, but more I kind of liked his rhythm playing, like the swing in his playing, more than anything. Like the way he and Alex grooved together, that was like incredible.
I did hear the Brown sound actually applies to Alex's playing rather than Eddie's
Yeah,
playing.
I mean, sometimes it's about his snare drum, it's about the guitar sound. I don't know. There's a lot of different myths, and you know how the internet works. The legends and myths keep propagating. So who knows?
So who are your main influences?
Sorry.
Who are your influences, both in terms of musicianship and in terms of guitar playing? Who were your main influences?
The first big one, I guess, was George Harrison, because I went through that huge Beatles phase. The next one was Slash from Guns N' Roses. And then because of Slash, I got into Joe Perry and, traced backwards. And shortly afterwards, I found Led Zeppelin. Then Jimmy Page became like especially like the riffs, not so much the soloing thing. Like there's some cool solos, obviously, but I wasn't really, I was big on like the writing. The songwriting was a huge inspiration. So generally, I found like all the guys who could write nice riffs, who were kind of blues based and melodic. If these three were present, they were my guys. So then Hendrix came a little bit later. David Gilmour, Mark Knopfler, all the classic British guys. Brian May, Robin Trower, all that got into. And once the internet happened, then you were able to kind of read the guitar magazine and download the song that they were talking about, and then make the correlation. Otherwise, you were reading the guitar magazine and trying to imagine what was going on. you know, like Chet Atkins was a big one because my dad used to listen to a lot of Chet. Um, I'm trying to think of like some oddball ones. Santana, Carlos Santana. My dad's a big Santana fan. Then Terry Kath from Chicago. I heard that song 25 or 624, man. That solo blew me away. And Clapton with Cream, that was huge. Don Felder from the Eagles. Man,
Ah, that.
I wore out so many of those cassettes just like rewinding, again and again.
No, I still remember the introduction to the unplugged version of California when they reunited in 1994, and he
Yeah,
plays something on nylon string guitar, and I'm thinking, what a lovely feel.
yeah,
Very underrated there, isn't he?
yeah, totally. And that's all on one of these nights, man. That was like, how the hell is he doing that? And then, like recently, I kind of, was able to slow it down and learn it
I learned
properly.
that watching you. I learned that watching you.
Yeah.
Lovely, lovely. But it was reassuring to hear that it does hurt the fingers. I played it with a set of tens and I asked you, does it really hurt? And you said yes.
Yeah, I found it a bit easier on the SG because that guitar plays like butter, so that's like my easiest playing guitar. If I'm struggling, I'll pop the SG on it and everything becomes easy then.
And what item
Another one
as
I
well?
didn't mention was this guy Mick Ralphs from Bad Company.
Yes.
Beautiful guitar player, man, with some killer stuff. And the early Whitesnake with Bernie Marsden and Mick Moody, just love that stuff. Michael Schenker from UFO,
Yeah.
another melodic blues bass guitar, and then Gary Moore and Stevie Ray Vaughan happened in a huge way.
And for you, is it Gary Moore the rocker, Gary Moore the jazz guitarist, or Gary Moore the blues
All of
guitarist?
it, because I got this cassette called Ballads and Blues, which is kind of like a retrospective compilation, and there was like everything from that solo in Always Gonna Love You to Still Got the Blues, and there was this lovely song called Blues for Narada, which I still think is one of my favorite guitar tones on record.
Was that for Narada Michael Walden
Yeah,
or for somebody
yeah,
else?
that was for him. And so, like, I love that song so much. I wrote a song called Blues for Gary on my first album.
Okay. Right. So I had a few questions. I
Yeah.
need to get down here because you've entertained me very much. Oh, I was going to say, what defines you as a musician? What would you say is Warren, quintessentially Warren as a musician?
Um, the ability to write stuff that I can listen to, again and again. And once I get an idea that inspires me to keep building on it, then I kind of think things happen very subconsciously where I don't really have to think about it and I can just let my, you know, inner ear or whatever you want to call it guide things. And then it's almost like I take a step back and I just watch the process happen. And I find like if I have to think and rack my head, then I tend to get stuck. Then I tend to get into my own head, and I overthink things. But if I'm able to just let the process flow and I'm able to capture it while that's happening, then I can actually listen back to it. I was like, oh, that's cool. I don't even remember like being conscious when this happened. You know what I mean? It's like your mind drifts off to another place and you just become a conduit. So I'm always I'm always trying to chase that feeling.
So, may I assume that for you, of your own compositions, the ones that came the most spontaneously and the easy ones are the ones that are the best compositions for you
Yeah,
as
and
compared
for most
to.
of the listeners as well, because just going by people's feedback, like when you play a song live, you can tell which ones go across better. Sometimes some of them need like repeated listening to get into it. But the ones which just grab them straight away are the ones which, it's like I felt like I was just like a antenna receiving some reception from somewhere.
Okay. And where do you see yourself, Warren, in 5, 10 years' time? What any ambitions? What do
Man,
you want
one
to
thing
do?
the pandemic has taught me is to live each day for itself. So I'm trying to be more in the moment and take each day as it comes. So if I'm able to get back into a regular gigging thing once my daughter's a little bit older, that would be cool. And if it doesn't happen, then I've got like plenty of cool memories to look back and say, had some good times.
So, as a professional musician, are you looking to continue your career as a professional musician, or are you going to look at something else
Um,
whilst you
Again,
moved half?
man, I mean, if the right regular job comes along, like say in a music production studio or something like that, that's cool. Otherwise, being a freelance and doing the monthly hustle to cover the bills, that's also cool. As long as I'm not stuck in some kind of a dead end thing, which has it's like putting a paper bag on your brain, that kind of a thing. So I just want to not do that. I mean, you never know. Sometimes you don't have a choice, right? So if the right thing comes along, I don't mind. Like as long as it keeps me, as long as it keeps your brain alive and your creative spirit intact.
And are you still in personal and or professional contact with musicians that you used to work with in India? Is
Yeah.
that something you still do remotely?
Yep, I do that. In fact, I've worked with, I think, both Amit Trivedi and Vishal Shekhar in the last few months on music. And I do a bit of mixing also now. So now I'm kind of keen actually to help some of the younger kids with their music. So if I find someone who writes music that, because when you're mixing, you have to keep on listening to it again and again. So you better make sure that you enjoy that part of the process.
Mhm.
So I sometimes I'm able to help some young kids with their music, and it feels cool because at least it still keeps you relevant. Because otherwise, the last thing you want to be is like some uncle from the 90s or 2000s or whatever.
Yeah, that is true. So tell me a bit more about mixing. What do you use? Is it Logic that you use?
I've been on Cubase for a very long time, though I'm comfortable on Pro Tools and Logic as well. But Cubase has been my main DAW of choice. I've dabbled in Universal Audio's Luna, which comes bundled if you have, and I have a ton of their hardware gear. So that's another cool thing to try out as well. But generally, it's always been Cubase based for a very long time.
And do you work in an acoustically treated room or in a
It's
no?
somewhat treated like at least all my surfaces, there's plenty of stuff to create, diffusion in that sense. But I need to get a couple of bass straps for the corners and one of those overhead things. I keep forgetting that I'm not in a rented house anymore and I own the house, so I can actually do that. But
Will
the
that be my job? Will you do it yourself with Rockwool or?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of friends who do construction. So right now we're still in level 3 here. So maybe once things open up and people can come into my house, then we can, look at it. Otherwise, it's just there's a lot of DIY available here as well. I mean, it's always been a very strong DIY ethic in New Zealand. So, if I read up a little bit and then maybe some of the basic, those foam panels on the wall for diffusion. Because I don't really like dead spaces, I like the room to have a little bit of life. And considering it's a smaller room, I don't want to deaden it completely. So I think just to make sure the low end is translating,
Yeah.
I'm kind of lucky now because I've got these Mackie HR824 Mark I speakers, which I first learned to mix on. When I first joined a recording studio, that's what the studio had. And my brother found them like for a steal on some local auction thing. And I was like, okay, bro, you can have my speakers. I'm taking those. So
They have quite a bit of low end extension, don't they? The
yeah,
A24.
they go down pretty low. You don't really need a sub with them, which is kind of cool.
Yes, because otherwise you find yourself increasing the bass, and then when you play it back in the car, it
Yeah.
sounds very boom.
Exactly. And I learned that the hard way before I got these speakers. I used to always take the mixes and play it in the car. I was like, man, I did too much bass. So between the car actually became my main monitoring system, and this was just like
Because it's consistent, isn't it? The car.
yeah.
Why is the car your main system where you evaluate your work?
I guess because your mind is also on driving, you kind of become less analytical about it and you're more kind of reacting of the emotional impact, right? Which most of your listeners will be reacting that way. I mean, your listeners are not mix engineers, they're listeners. So,
Yeah.
in that sense, I'm able to kind of, tune out that bit of my brain a little bit. And you can hear the deficiency in the mix right away. If there's too much bass, you'll hear it. If it's too dull, you'll hear it. Those broad strokes kind of things.
And what
Otherwise,
car are we talking?
it's a Kia Sportage, which has a pretty nice sounding. I don't know what is in it, but it sounds nice.
And do you play recordings that you like in it first to familiarize yourself with the system and then play your own sound in it?
Yeah, though generally if my daughter's in the car, she gets like she gets the call what songs on. But um, I guess, yeah, I did listen to a lot of familiar music in it first, dial that, basic EQ. My brother's got the exact same car, but his EQ preferences are very different to mine.
Okay, right. And when it comes to mastering, if you've mixed a track yourself, would you master it yourself or would you prefer a fresh pair of ears, somebody else to master
It,
it?
I would generally prefer someone who has like some nice analog gear to, add some fairy dust on it. But given that most Blackstrat Blues albums are, funded by me, then it becomes like, you know, might as well take like a few weeks off and not listen to it, and then come back to it with freshers and do the master.
And do it yourself,
Yeah.
yes.
As long as you have
What
that break, because like if you go just from mixing to mastering, it's a disaster. It never works that way. So you need to kind of just get all that out. So it takes like 3 or 4 weeks to get it out of your head, and then you just come back with fresh hits.
what about you as the man? Tell us about you.
Me as the
Apart from
man.
what else do you do apart from music?
Well, right now my main job is being dad because we are in lockdown level 3 here. My wife works from home. So while she works in one room of our house, my daughter is running, she's got the full run of the house. So I kind of have to make sure that, it does, like every day it's like a battle so the house doesn't turn into a battlefield. So yeah, till she goes back to school, which is apparently sometime soon. So maybe once things move in that direction, then I'll have a little bit more time to maybe work on some new music or whatever. But other than that, I think I've like found a newfound interest in cooking because again I have to cook most of the time. Once in a while, the wife will do it on the weekends and everything, but on a day-to-day thing, unless it's like some one of those things you just put it in the oven and it's done. So you try to avoid that and cook from scratch. And I found like cooking is a bit like mixing because it's like the correct balance of things. And if you're using this, then that goes along with it. But then don't use that ingredient if you're using that sort of thing.
Post production doesn't work in cooking, does it?
Yeah, you can't. I mean, you can add some sauce and some chili and whatever, but if you don't get it right, from the tadka, from the ground up. And my philosophy to recording is the same way now because I don't really have the time to sift through stuff. When people send me like 150 tracks, I'm just like, bro, that means you haven't really done your work of making those decisions and you've left it to me to do it. So sometimes you have to.
Which makes me want to ask you, and many of the people watching this program would have at least dabbled, if not actually done proper recording themselves. By the time you have a drum track, a bass, and a rhythm guitar, it often sounds really good.
Yeah.
You've got drums in the middle, bass in the middle, rhythm guitar, maybe pan to one side, it sounds really good. And then the more guitars, the more tracks you add, it actually sounds less full. And I don't think anybody exemplifies this better than AC/DC. What a
Yeah.
full sound they get with two guitars, drums, and bass. Have you found that when you record? Are you a
Yeah.
minimalist yourself, or do you?
No, sometimes I can go overboard, but then it's kind of like then you have to start pulling stuff out. Like you listen, is it adding anything to the mix? If not, pull it out. That's the thing. So it's like you've got a gig, and there's like say 1 lakh, for the musicians, 100,000 for the music. Now, if you got one musician, that guy gets all the money. Now, if you got two, each guy gets half of that. If you got three, then and so on and so forth. So the more you keep adding, there's less bandwidth that you're able to allocate to each instrument. And then you kind of have to say, okay, if you're doing like guitar layers, then this guy is the main guy, and then these guys who are the supporting guys can become like much smaller. So a lot of what I do is just low pass and high pass. Just take out
Yeah.
some lows, take out some highs, and just find where that instrument, is most dominant, and keep only those frequencies in the mix. I think if you get that right, if you record, properly, it's just a matter of doing that low pass, high pass, and maybe just shifting the mid range up and down a little bit. Like if you've got, distortion rhythm guitars, and you pull out like some 400, and you bump that on the bass, then those two don't fight in that range. And even say somewhere higher up in the higher mids, you pull out some high mids and you give that to the solo guitar, and that sits better. So you kind of learn those things over time, trial and error.
And you've learned that whilst working in the studios in Bombay or sitting in front of your own little system and
Both. I would watch like what other guys would do in the studio. Not necessarily with guitars, because they would most of the time leave that to me. But like with other instruments, like vocals, for example. That's why I kind of learned, okay, don't fight in that, because that's the range where the vocal is most dominant. So don't ever cloud that frequency. So I mean, there's only so many frequencies you've got, right? From like 20 to 20K. So you kind of have to be a little judicious about that. It's kind of like creating an illusion. That's what you're doing. And there's a nice book I read once by this guy called Michael Stavro, called Mixing with Your Mind. And his motto, or his whatever his key phrase was, maximum illusion with minimum voltage. So if you look at your meters, kind of try to get things sounding as big as you can without hogging headroom. Like everyone loves like big low end and stuff like that, but if you kind of do that on all the instruments, it's going to start fighting and sound muddy as hell. So you kind of have to say, okay, you get the full low end, and everyone else, no, you don't get it. So you clean that out. Or even like the higher side of things, like say your shakers or something, and you've got shakers and you've got like a ride cymbal. Now the high frequencies, you have to kind of say, okay, now the ride will take like the highest frequencies, and the shaker will, that sort of thing. It's just like knowing what you're doing before you reach for the knob to do it.
look, Warren, it's been an absolute pleasure interviewing you. You have played some of the most touching and moving guitar music that I've heard. It's
Oh,
been an
thank you.
absolute pleasure and an honor to interview you. Can I ask you as a parting question,
Yeah, sure.
how would you like to be remembered as a musician?
Um, Someone who wrote some cool music. I guess if people still find whatever I've written relevant for years to come, if the human race still exists at that point, then that my job is done. And if my daughter grows into a fine human being again, then I'll be gone happy.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for the honor and privilege of interviewing you.
Thanks, Jay,
Wish you
man.
the
It's been a blast.
very best in your life. Take care.